Chapter 12, Powering the Board for the First Time. This is kind of an exciting bit because it's right before everything starts coming together. And we're also testing our early work. So before we do this, we want to make sure that the jumper has been removed from the VN pins over here. This is like the last line of defense, as I mentioned earlier in the build, or at the beginning. So we're going to take that out, and we're going to have our handy dandy multimeter ready, and we're going to turn it on to the continuity setting. Again, that's the one that shows might have an icon looking like a Wi-Fi icon on your phone. I'm going to touch the probes together to make sure that we're going to be able to hear it if there's a short. And then we're going to first probe the battery and USB pins. So I'm just getting the plus and minus. It doesn't matter which one it is. I'm not hearing any tone. Do I have it on right? Yes. Test it again, no tone. Now we're going to test the other pins, no tone. If I want, I can double check and test the ground pins of both those connectors, and you'll hear there's a tone. So we know ground is connected for both of them together. The next thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to test the ground, and at the test points, I'm going to test the ground and VCC over here at the unpopulated test points. As mentioned in the guide, if you hear a brief tone, it's because of capacitance in those large capacitors we've put in there. It drained out, and if we touch it again, we see there's no tone. All right, so I'm going to probe that ground pin on the one that's labeled MCU. That's the power that goes to the controller, the filter, and AO. Everything looks good. I'm going to flip the board over, and now we're going to check the capacitors. There are a couple capacitors on here for the lights. They're not connected to the rest of the system, so we for sure want to check those and make sure there's no shorting. So I'm going to find where those pins are, where I clipped them off earlier, and probe those. You hear a little chirp because we're testing capacitors and they've got a little charge in them. But if you tap again and there's no continuous tone, you're good. I'm going to test these guys over here. There was a little chirp from some capacitance built up, but then otherwise nothing. And I'm just going to play with the other capacitor leads while I'm at it. There we go. There's some capacitance in that, and now it's gone. If I keep tapping it, I'm not hearing anything. And while we hit the last capacitor over here. There it is. It drained out. It had capacitance in it, but now it's gone. If I touch it and slide these probes around on those pins, no more tone. So this board is good. There's no shorts on it right now. The next step, still with that VN jumper removed, the next step I have in the guide is to plug in the battery box. Here's the battery box. I'm going to plug it into the battery connector on the end, like so, and turn on the battery box. We already know that switch works because we've tested previous gear. Now, as you see, it's turned on the battery, well, you don't see, but the battery box is turned on and there's no LED lid on the bottom side. That means that we've got the polarity correct going into the battery connector. So I'm going to turn that battery box off, and we're going to wire up the USB connector next. I've got the USB connector here. It's in the adapter. I've got the housing on the end of it, and it's also labeled USB. So I'm going to plug that into 5-volt wall power. Again, you want to use a 5-volt wall block, not a high power one that's capable of more. None of this PD business and laptop chargers, because it will not work properly. And I'm going to slip that connector into the USB port connector on the board. And there it is. There should be 5 volts in there. And there is no LED on the bottom side. Here are the 2 LEDs. If they light red, disconnect power, disconnect the leads, the connector housing, and troubleshoot. And again, I'm going to disconnect power just to be thorough, and you can see I'm lifting with the tweezers at the shoulders of it, and there it comes off. As one last demonstration, I have wired some DuPont connectors to the leads from the battery box, and I'm going to demonstrate reverse polarity. Or rather, hopefully the reverse polarity protection works. I'm doing this on an actual board that will be shipped, but I will demonstrate there will be no damage to it. Again, I'm going to do this with that jumper removed, so no power gets further into the board than the front end where it enters. Now I'm going to connect the positive of lead from the battery to the negative lead on the board, and vice versa with the other. And I'll turn it up here so you'll see the LED when I connect it. Oh, first you got to turn on the power, right? There we go. Okay, now you'll see that there will be an LED lights. So the LED light's red to indicate reverse polarity, but there's no damage that should be occurring to the board right now because nothing gets through there. So if you connect your connectors and you see a light coming from under that area during these portions of the test, that's how you will understand and see that it's reverse polarity. One more time. It used to give me the heebie-jeebies testing this, but now I've got confidence in the gear and it's all tested great. If you have the board down, we'll see if you see any illumination from the underside when it's connected reverse polarity. Yeah, you can still see a little glow of the red from the underside. So do check that when you do check for that, and maybe lift it when you're doing those tests. So I've got it set up here for the final portion of this power testing, the hang testing. And I know it looks a little janky, but I've got everything, and off camera, I've got everything applied to the circuit board at this point. We have the touch pin. The touch pin connectors plugged in the back. We've got the V-in jumper plugged in at the side here. And I've connected all the respective connectors from the project to the circuit board. I call it hang testing because we're testing this while the board is still on the outside and before making everything semi-permanent. We've already done all the prior testing. I've mounted the audio module, and the speaker is sitting inside the box just to keep it out of the way. And now I'm going to power this thing on for the first time. Let's double check if I've missed anything else per the guide. Yes, I've put the lid on the top of the box. Even though it's on its side, it's retained because of the magnets. I've inserted the, I can't get it on camera here. I've inserted the USB port from the outside to the inside and connected up the USB-C connector to the board as well. Although that cable is not connected yet, I'm just doing the battery box power test. So when you power it on the first time, as you'll see down here, it doesn't say to actually apply power yet because I want you to read ahead and know what it should look like when you do the power on. When you apply battery the first time, you should observe the 3 lights pulsing. And that indicates that it has the circuit board has good communication with the audio module, and it read the audio card just fine. So the window lights, the sign light, and the top light will all pulse, so you know what to look for when you turn on the power switch. It won't do anything else. It'll just go back to sleep. And I know you couldn't see that, so I'm going to turn it off again. And you did hear a little buzz. You hear that little buzz come when the audio module is initialized and is powered up. And it'll do it every time. So when it's on battery power, the whole board, it shuts down. There's power gating all over the board for the lights and the audio module and sensors. So you will hear that buzz every time. But when it's inside the project, it's almost inaudible. And when it's plugged into wall power, it turns on the audio module and leaves it on. So therefore, it doesn't need to initialize each time it's triggered to play. And I've also cut out the 1.5 second time initialization time that it needs just by leaving it on when it's plugged into wall power, and that doesn't hurt anything. So I'm going to swing the camera around again so you can see the light action, at least those 2 lights action, when I power on and turn on the battery box. No, nothing happened. The reason nothing happened is because it's very power efficient, and it's got those capacitors on there. And even when I turn off the battery box, the capacitors still hold charge. And because the board is so efficient when it's in standby mode like that, waiting to be triggered or waiting for you to activate with the touch sensor or replacing the lid, even with the battery box off, it still takes several minutes for it to drain that voltage from the capacitors. So I'm just leaving it off for a couple more minutes, and I might expedite the process by shorting power and ground with a resistor. And power up again so you can see the lights. So hopefully I've discharged enough of the capacitors that we will get the proof of life pulse, is what I call it. Proof of life pulse when I turn on the battery box again now. and that's all it is. Now it's ready to go. So I'm going to touch the touch sensor to trigger a play cycle. If it's on battery power like this, touching the touch sensor or replacing the lid will trigger a play cycle. And you'll probably also hear some audio from it. That audio is pretty quiet. What I'm going to do is I'm going to turn up the speaker. I don't think I adjusted that trimmer for it when I did the build, so I'm going to turn it up all the way and back it off about maybe a fifth, so it's more impressive. If you remove the lid during the play cycle like this, well, it'll still keep playing. At least this time. So I put the lid on, let it finish playing, and then I'm going to trigger it again. This time I'm going to trigger it by separating the lid so those connectors come apart like that. And now when I put it back on, it'll trigger a play cycle.
It's called the TARDIS. It can travel anywhere in time and space. And it's mine.
It plays the audio clip and pulses the lights until the audio clip finishes, or until 15 seconds has passed, whichever comes later. And then it goes back to sleep. On the AA batteries, this thing, 6 triggers a day, this thing will last for months. The battery box is still on and the lid is still connected. What I'm going to do now is plug in a USB-C cable to the port already in the backside, and what you should observe is the top light and the sign light strip fading on. Sorry about the bump there. So plug it in. You hear a little buzz because it turns on the audio module, and it will leave it on as long as it's plugged into wall power. I know those lights are lit. If I separate the lid now, nothing happens. When I replace the lid, now we'll see the action. There you go, the end of the audio clip, and the lights pulsed until they're faded up. They come back up to the light setting that it was before. We are now in lamp mode since it's plugged in and the lighting stays on. I'm going to touch the touch sensor. Now you've seen what touching the battery, replacing the lid does when it's on wall power. Now we're going to touch the touch sensor and it cycles the lighting. The next step, first step, when you plug in the external power, it turns on the top and sign lights. Touch the touch sensor, and it'll add the window lights. Touch it again, it turns them all on. So in this way, we can cycle the lighting through a couple stages here. I don't have a stage where it's only the top light, because in the show, often seen, it will have the top light and the sign lights lit when the windows are off. I can change that code, alter it in the future for future builds, or someone who's techie and knowledgeable enough can flash a firmware update on their boards. But for the time being, I think I'm just leaving it when you plug in that it brings up both the top light and the sign light. So we function tested everything on the box. It all looks good.